России государств.
So Russian President Vladimir Putin has recognized the independence of two separate regions in eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic.
Считаю необходимым принять уже давно назревшее решение. Незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
This was a move that is severely going to ratchet up tensions with the West. This decision, of course, raising fears that Moscow could use this as a pretext to send in troops to try and protect these two quote-unquote newly independent republics. Putin has already ordered Russia's military to act as peacekeepers in both these breakaway regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. In this week's Crux Decode, I will explain what Vladimir Putin's game plan is in recognizing these two regions as independent republics. What is the strategy he's employed? Has he used this template similarly in the past? And what the response from the West is likely to be. But first, what are these two republics, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics? Collectively, they're known as the Donbass region. They declared independence from Kiev. This was back in 2014, right after the Kremlin sent in Russian troops to annex Crimea. Soon after that, there were insurgent groups, extremist groups, who had backing from Russia, who were employed in this Donbass region, both in Donetsk and in Luhansk. Now, this region sits on Ukraine's border with Russia. It's on the northern banks of the Black Sea. It's home to about 3.5 million people or so, and it's been largely reliant on Moscow for financial help, humanitarian assistance, and of course, most importantly, military aid. Now, Russia has consistently denied any involvement in this particular conflict in Donbass, but it has worked very hard to secure a very tight hold in this region. Out of the 3.5 million people, more than 700,000, that's 1 in 5, have been given Russian passports in the last 7 or 8 years. So what exactly does Moscow's recognition of these eastern territories mean? Now, for the very first time, Russia has declared that it does not regard Donbass as a part of Ukraine. Now, this could allow Moscow to send in military troops into the separatist regions openly, under, of course, the pretext that it's only intervening to protect an ally country because they are being threatened by the forces of Ukraine. Now, that would, of course, likely increase the risk of a full-blown war. After all, Ukraine would see this, and rightfully so, as a complete breach of its territorial integrity and sovereignty. Remember, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops are amassed exactly at this place, just off the eastern part of Ukraine. Now, this move to recognize these two independent republics effectively brings an end to all the efforts so far to try and resolve the conflict in these two regions. Now, remember, back in 2015, right after the annexation of Crimea, there was the Minsk II agreement that was signed, that was underwritten by some of the biggest powers in Europe, Germany, France, etc., whereby Russia and Ukraine agreed, both in letter and spirit, not to invade the Donbass region. Also, Ukraine was to devolve its powers to these two areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, and eventually an autonomous government was to be formed in these two regions. Unfortunately, that is not how it's played out over the last 7 years or so. There's been a military ceasefire, yes, on paper, also a pullback of heavy weapons, but unfortunately, there have been repeated skirmishes and repeated breaches of this ceasefire. Like I said, there have been separatists that have been employed there by Russia, as also separatists who owe allegiance to Ukraine, both of whom have been fighting, supported, of course, by the regular troops of both the Russian and the Ukrainian armies. Now, eventually, Ukraine had committed to seeing some kind of a political autonomy solution for these two regions, but that has not happened. It had also promised local elections under Ukrainian law under the Minsk II agreement. Again, that is dead in the water. So now the question is, has Vladimir Putin employed this same playbook in other parts of the Caucasus. Yes, Russia has. In Georgia in 2008, after it recognized the independence of two regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are two breakaway regions of Georgia. Similar to what is happening now, Putin accused Georgia of attacking these two regions. It allowed him to use tens of thousands of Russian troops, send them into Georgia, and annex these two regions. Russian citizenship was given to many of the people in these two regions. He did that again in 2014 with greater military force by annexing Crimea. There again, he used the pretext that a large number of the people there, and many of them are Russian speakers, do not want to owe their allegiance to Ukraine, and therefore he was going in to help a friendly territory. And that is the exact same playbook that he is using now in 2022 as well. So now the question is, how is the West going to respond? You've already seen an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council. Western leaders from US President Joe Biden to British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to the French President Emmanuel Macron to the new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have all condemned this move, and they have said that they will be imposing severe and serious sanctions on Russia. In fact, the United States has already announced financial sanctions against these two regions. It's also warned all American citizens and businesses that they are simply not allowed to do any kind of business in these two regions. There's going to be no fresh investment or trade or financing in these two separatist regions. The problem is this: the West has employed exactly these same tactics, both in Georgia as well as in Crimea, and it has not worked. Sanctions are simply not going to work against Russia and against Vladimir Putin because over the last 20 years, he has perfected the Russian economy to be sanctions-proof. Much of the Russian economy, which is dependent on sale of gas and oil, much of this happens outside the sanctions framework, and that's why no matter how many other sanctions the West is able to impose on Moscow, that will have very little impact against the Kremlin's behavior. So now the question arises, what other options does the West have? Now clearly, the West is not going to allow a recognition of both of these independent republics. The Ukrainian army will likely fight in the Donbass region with, of course, support, whether it is air support or other ground-based support for the Ukrainian military. It is likely to be a long, protracted war with the Russian troops. And remember, Russia is one of the foremost armies in the world right now, and close to 200,000 troops are on the ready there in the Donbass region. So it's going to be a long, protracted war, something similar to what we have seen the Russian government under Putin employ in places like Syria. So you're going to expect a long war with sanctions and the threat of counter-sanctions. The West, of course, is going to say the right things, that they're committed to Ukraine's independence, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and of course, they will make sure that the new independent republics of Donetsk and Luhansk are not recognized by any of the global bodies, including the United Nations. So what exactly will happen now? Putin's recognition of these rebel-held territories as being independent republics, like I said earlier, completely shatters the Minsk II peace agreement. He also suggests he's no longer interested in diplomatic efforts to try and avoid any further conflict with Ukraine. It's also likely to further fuel tensions with the West. Sanctions have already been imposed. More sanctions are expected from the European allies, and talks are expected to discuss what else the United States and the European Union can do. Putin has also said that Moscow would now sign friendship treaties with both the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, a move that could pave the way for Russia to openly support these two independent republics with both troops as well as weapons. Now, overnight, in two official decrees, Putin has also instructed his defense ministry to quote-unquote assume the function of peacekeeping both in Donetsk and in Luhansk. Now, this is laying the ground, laying the pretext, as it were, to eventually send in full-fledged troops, the almost 200,000 who've been stationed in the eastern part there, to send them in under official cover of peacekeeping.